In 1976, a book came out, and it was one of the first new books on Milton Erickson. It was called Hypnotic Realities. And Erickson was co-authoring with a fellow by the name of Rossi. And at the beginning, Rossi was studying Erickson's inductions. And there's this really standard Ericksonian induction, and Erickson and Rossi are commenting on it. And then the transcript breaks, and it says, at this point, Dr. Erickson began to tell a story which we have omitted because it wasn't relevant. If you go into my inner office, you will see that of all the Ericksonian books, I am missing only one book. That just won't happen on my shelves. At the same time, there was a young man, a college student going for his master's at the time, yes? Who went and trained with Dr. Erickson, who recognized that the stories were in fact what Erickson was doing, and he wrote a book called Therapeutic Metaphors. The day that I got that book, it changed my life. I started reading chapter by chapter, and I started doing all of the things in the chapters. And lo and behold, it really works. And I ended up doing my doctoral dissertation on therapeutic metaphor, which David helped and advised, and my school did not know anything about therapeutic metaphor, Erickson, or the dirty word hypnosis. So I had to get people to sign off on my paper, and they had to look at the stories that I wrote, and were they really therapeutic metaphors? And David was very generous with his time, and he sent me 2 letters. One was the official letter that said, these are wonderful stories, these are fine examples of Ericksonian metaphors. It was just a really short letter. This is great, it's wonderful, please send me the results, whatever. Then there was like the 4-page, Dear Harlan. If you really want this to work, you might want to do the following. David was one of the core group of the developers of NLP, who sat in the living room of John Grinder and came up with a whole bunch of the patterns. There are things that you use on a daily basis, the well-formedness conditions, submodalities, and therapeutic metaphor, the storytelling. Those were all processes that David came up with. So training with David, which is something that I've had the pleasure of doing a couple of times, is always a special, unique experience. David's stories are gems. I have stolen his stories, and I have used them so many times that I have a hard time telling the difference between his story and my story, because I think that vicariously I lived through all of them. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce David Gordon.
It was fun to hear that. I forgot about those 2 letters. Well, good morning. Listen, I think I'll tell you a story. Now, you're going to be busy with that camera because, as you can tell already, I like to move. So I'm just warning you about that. Well, there was this man. He grew up in a small town, and he was happy. He was content. This was the town he was born and raised in. He went to school in this town. All of the children that he grew up with also stayed in this town. So when he wandered around this town, most of the people he saw, he knew. He knew them by name. He knew every street. He knew every building in this town. And so he was happy there. He was content. He got older. He married a woman who also grew up in that town, and they got a nice house in a neighborhood that he was very familiar with and had children. And every day he'd get in his car and he'd drive to work through the streets that he knew so well, and he was happy. Life was good and life was very easy. And he had no reason or desire to change anything about it. One morning he woke up, he kissed his wife goodbye and kissed his children goodbye, and he stepped out the front door, and it was a beautiful day. And he said, boy, what a great town I live in. I want everything to stay just the way it is. And then he got an idea that he'd never had before, which was, he thought, maybe I'll walk to work instead of drive today. And so, uncharacteristically, he walked down the sidewalk heading into town. Well, along the way, he's walking through these neighborhoods that he drove through every day. And because he was walking, he had a little more time. He started noticing neighbors who had planted flowers that he hadn't noticed before. And he could look through people's windows as he walked by and see that, oh, the Caldwells have new furniture. He hadn't noticed that before because he'd been driving through. He started noticing little details about the homes and the yards as he walked by. And as he walked through that neighborhood, noticing these things, he said, maybe I should walk to work a little more often. Well, when he said that, all of a sudden he started hearing this strange sound behind him. And it wasn't a pleasant sound, it was an annoying, frightening sound. It was like rumbling, And as soon as he heard it, it scared him. It scared him so much that he was determined not to turn around to see what it was. So he just kept walking, pretending it wasn't there. Except that sound kept getting louder and closer and closer. Pretty soon it was just rumbling behind him, like that, right behind him. And he couldn't help it anymore. He had to turn around to see what it was. And when he turned around, there was this guy on a big motorcycle, a big Harley, a hog, big Harley Davidson. And this guy, he'd never seen anything like this guy before. He was all dressed, black leather, with metal studs everywhere. This guy was tough. He had tattoos all over him. He had metal studs in his head. This guy was tough. This guy was really tough. And he's standing there, revving his engine, and the guy from the town is staring at him like this. And this guy in the Harley says, "What are you looking at?" And the guy made the wrong response. He said, "Nothing." Well, the guy in the Harley knew he wasn't nothing. He took offense. He said, "Oh, yeah?" So he got off his bike. He grabbed this guy. He gagged him. He blindfolded him and tied his hands behind his back, threw him on the back of that motorcycle, and roared away. This guy was scared out of his mind. He knew he was going to be killed. He knew he was a dead man. That motorcycle drove for 1 hour, then 2 hours, and 3 hours. And this guy knew he was being taken somewhere to be killed. And finally the motorcycle stopped. And he was dragged off the motorcycle and dumped onto the ground. And there he was laying there all gagged and bound, waiting to be shot. And all of a sudden the motorcycle roared away. This guy, at first he didn't move a muscle because he thought, oh, this is a trick. He wants to see he wants to see me escape, and then he's going to kill me. But it was really quiet. It was the most quiet he'd ever not heard. And after a while, he realized he's alone. So he started working at his bonds, and he got them off. He jumped to his feet, took off his gag so he could start screaming for help right away. And he took off his blindfold, and he was stunned at what he saw. He wasn't in town anymore. He was out in the middle of the desert. He was out in the middle of nowhere. As far as he could look, he turned all the way around. As far as he could look, there was nothing there but desert, just desert going on and on as far as he could see. And he had no idea which direction home was. But he wanted more than anything to get back to home, so he started walking in a direction that he hoped would take him in that direction. Well, he started walking, very manfully at first. I'm going home. But then you know what happens in the desert.
Get hot.
Sun starts coming up, gets higher and higher, and it gets hotter and hotter. So he's walking manfully for a while, but then he's not walking so manfully anymore, because he's getting tired and he's getting hot. And he starts dragging his feet. And that sun keeps getting higher, and you can feel his skin cooking, and his lips are starting to dry out and crack. His tongue is swelling up. Gets to where he's having difficulty thinking. And the hours pass. And pretty soon he's dragging his feet through the sand. And there comes upon him a moment when he realizes he's not going to make it. He's going to die out there in the desert. He's going to die out there in the sun. In that moment, when he realized that, he's standing there in that sun in his face, and he says, "Oh God, if only I could die in the shade. I don't want to have to die in the sun, at least if I could die in the shade." A couple tears, that's all he could afford, were like 2 tears coming down his cheeks, you know. And he looks over, and there is the only thing he can see all around him, which is this small creosote bush. And underneath there's this space, just big enough for him to get underneath. And in that space is a little bit of shadow, a little bit of shade. And he dives underneath that bush in that shadow, and he sits there thinking, "Oh, thank goodness, at least now I can die in the shade." Well, he's not sitting there too very long before a hawk flies down, and it lands on the ground next to him. And the hawk looks up at him, says, "What are you doing here?" And the guy says, "Well, I'm waiting to die." The hawk says, "Oh, really? Why must you die?" The guy says, "Well, I'm out in the middle of the desert without any water. Of course I'm going to die." And the hawk lifts his wing and says, "Well, why don't you follow that coyote right there?" All of a sudden, whoop, there was a coyote. And it started trotting off. And this guy, completely amazed at this, gets up out from underneath the bush and follows the coyote. And that coyote leads him down into arroyos and shows him where he can dig in what looks like dry sand and find water down below. The coyote shows him what plants he can pull up that have roots that he can chew on and squeeze to get water out of. And when the man has drunk his fill and he's got water again, he stands up satisfied, you know. And he feels that sun beating down on his face, you know. And he freaks out. Oh my God, I'm out in the sun. I don't want to die in the sun, I want to die in the shade." And he runs back and gets underneath the bush so he can die in the shade. Well, the hawk's still there. The hawk says, "Well, what are you doing here?" The guy says, "Well, I want to die in the shade." The hawk says, "Well, why must you die?" The man says, "Well, I'm out in the desert with no food. Of course I'm going to die without any food." The hawk says, "Well, why don't you follow that rattlesnake right there?" All of a sudden, boop, there's a rattlesnake. And the rattlesnake starts slithering across the sand, you know. And this guy jumps up and starts following the rattlesnake. And the rattlesnake shows him what holes he can safely reach into and find eggs that he can eat. The rattlesnake shows him what plants that he can eat that he can eat for energy, and what plants he can pull up and eat their roots. And after a while, this man had eaten his fill, you know, and he stood up, satisfied. He felt the sun beating down on his face again. And he freaks out. Oh my God, I'm out in the sun. I don't want to die in the sun, I want to die in the shade." And he runs back and gets underneath the bush so he can die in the shade. Well, the hawk's still there. He says, "You're back?" He says, "What now?" The guy says, "Well, I've been to the movies. I know if you're out in the desert and you don't have salt, you'll die. You got to have salt, and I don't have salt, so I'm going to die right here in the shade." And the hawk says, "All right. You follow that mule deer right there." All of a sudden, whoop, there's a mule deer. The mule deer starts trotting off across the desert, and the guy gets out and follows it. And the mule deer takes him to a natural salt lick. Then this guy breaks off pieces of salt and eats them. And he's feeling better. He stands up, feels the sun beating down on his face, and he freaks out. Oh my God, I'm out in the sun. I don't want to die in the sun, I want to die in the shade." And he runs back to the bush to die in the shade.